The disproportion of power and responsibility and oppression is so markedly on one side that if you take the worst thing you can say about Hamas, multiplied by 1,000 times, and it still will not meet the Israeli repression and killing and dispossession of Palestinians. Now, that's my view of it.
What an evil scumbag. It is literally sickening how much evil there is in the world. In this meme, we see a quote that reads, "Take the worst thing you can say about Hamas, multiply it by 1,000 times, and it still will not meet the Israeli repression, killing, and dispossession of Palestinians." It's attributed to Dr. Gabor Maté, and unfortunately, the quote is real. It's on video, as was just played. Now, a quick note before we begin. Memes often contain fake quotes, so it's always worth fact-checking before sharing. But in this case, the quote checks out. And it's so outrageous that it deserves a thorough response. But first, a few important clarifications. And yes, we will address the quote directly. We're not avoiding it. Let's start with the claim that Gabor Maté is a Holocaust survivor. Technically, that's true, but it's also deeply misleading. Maté was born on January 6, 1944, and World War II ended in Europe in May 1945. That means he was not even 18 months old when the war ended. The vast majority of adults have no memories before the age of 2. So while he did survive the Holocaust era as a Jewish infant in Nazi-occupied Hungary, he did not live through the trauma consciously, nor does he carry direct memory-based experience of the Holocaust. When we hear Holocaust survivor, we typically think of someone who endured the camps, experienced the loss of family, or survived death marches, someone who can testify to what they saw and felt. That's not the case here. Gabor Maté, like the rest of us, learned about the Holocaust from books, family stories, and historical accounts, not from first-hand memory. So why is this label included in the meme? Why bring up the Holocaust at all when discussing the Israel-Hamas conflict? The answer is rhetorical, not informational. Being labeled a Holocaust survivor doesn't provide any special insight into the Middle East, terrorism, or warfare, but it does serve a strategic function. It shields the speaker's views from criticism. Most people are understandably uncomfortable disagreeing with someone who has suffered deeply. We've been trained to respond to trauma with compassion, not confrontation. And so, the label Holocaust survivor in this context is being weaponized, intentionally or not, to discourage disagreement, not by argument, but by emotional intimidation. This is a classic example of victimhood as authority, amplified by the cultural influence of intersectionality, where the opinions of those deemed more oppressed are treated as more valid, regardless of their logic or factual basis. But let's be absolutely clear. Suffering does not make someone morally or intellectually superior. A Holocaust survivor, adult or child, is not automatically more right about political, moral, or historical matters than anyone else. And in Maté's case, the claim to trauma is mostly symbolic. Many people, like Dr. Gad Saad for instance, have endured far more personal suffering at an older age and remember every detail of it, but don't receive the same moral reverence because their suffering isn't packaged under a title like Holocaust survivor. So yes, Gabor Maté may hold the ultimate intersectionality card, but that card doesn't grant access to truth. It doesn't make his ideas immune from criticism, nor does it excuse deeply false and inflammatory statements, like the one we're about to address. Because in any honest moral discussion, claims must stand or fall on their merits, not on the identity of the person making them. Now, one final point before turning to the quote itself. Gabor Maté is described as a physician, author, and speaker in the post. While that may not be intended as rhetorical manipulation, it's important to understand that many people mistakenly assign greater authority to someone simply because they are a doctor. But this is irrational. Being skilled in medicine does not make someone morally wise or politically insightful. Doctors, like anyone else, can hold deeply flawed, even dangerous, ideological beliefs. As noted in the article, When Healers Become Killers, The Doctor as Terrorist, published by the Canadian Medical Association. Many erroneously think poverty and oppression are the root cause of terrorism. But in fact, many terrorists are well-educated and come from well-to-do families. Al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden, the son of a Saudi billionaire, studied economics at university. Moreover, as scholar Walter Laqueur writes in No End to War, a disproportionate number of doctors are terrorist leaders. Bin Laden's second in command, Ayman al-Zawahiri, George Habash, who founded the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, Fathi Shikaki, a founder of Palestinian Islamic Jihad. All were doctors. To be sure, doctors as killers are not unique to Islam. Nazi Germany readily found doctors to carry out genocidal programs. Nor did the Soviet Union lack for physicians in its re-education facilities. More recently, a Tokyo doctor was convicted of planting sarin gas on subway cars as part of a terrorist plot. So the idea that being a doctor inherently lends credibility to one's political or moral views is clearly false. And while this meme may not directly make an appeal to authority, many readers will subconsciously assume that his profession enhances the validity of his claims. But a medical degree does not grant expertise in Middle Eastern history, ethics, or geopolitics. In fact, one might argue that physicians are psychologically conditioned to humanize everyone, including criminals and terrorists, because of their professional obligation to provide care without judgment. This constant exposure to suffering can lead to a distorted moral lens, where even the most violent individuals evoke disproportionate empathy. A terrorist who murdered 50 people may still be seen, in the physician's eyes, as a vulnerable human deserving care. And they must treat this terrorist with utmost care and professionalism, no matter how evil their patient may be. That experience, repeated often enough, can shape softer political views and cloud harsh moral judgments. Being forced to care for evil people may soften them up to the carer. It's harder to hate someone when you are forced to treat them with care and compassion. This can weaken a doctor's ability to properly hate the wicked. This doesn't mean all doctors think this way, but it highlights a psychological trend worth considering when evaluating their commentary on war, justice, and accountability. That was a significant amount of commentary before even getting to the quote itself. So why include it? Because you need to learn how to think, how to analyze, and how to spot subtle manipulations. You won't always have someone there to explain it to you. My organization, and others like it, will help as much as possible, but new lies are constantly being pumped into the public. That's why you must eventually take responsibility for spreading truth and debunking falsehoods yourself. Now let's examine the math behind Gabor's claim. On October 7th alone, Hamas murdered 1.2 thousand people in the countless other atrocities they've committed over the years. Let's say, for argument's sake, that's the worst thing you could say about Hamas. Now multiply that by 1,000, as Gabor suggests. That gives you 1.2 million murders. And that's before we even mention the 251 hostages taken on that same day. Now ask yourself, when has Israel murdered 1.2 million Palestinians? Because that's the logical implication of Gabor's claim, that Israel's actions exceed even that scale of brutality. There is no way to interpret this that doesn't lead to a grotesque slander against Israel. It's a lie, and not even the most extreme Hamas propagandists fabricate numbers that absurd. And yes, as uncomfortable as it may be, Jews themselves can spread anti-Semitic lies. Being Jewish does not exempt someone from spreading blood libels or engaging in moral inversion. Falsehood knows no ethnic or religious boundaries. Even taken at face value, the quote is reckless, false, and deeply irresponsible. But we can go even further, because this kind of rhetoric sets the stage for justifying violence against Israel. In fact, shortly after citing Gabor's statement, Dan Kovalik, in his book The Case for Palestine, Why It Matters and Why You Should Care, wrote, "As an initial matter, it must be pointed out that, as occupied peoples, the Palestinians have the legal right to take up arms to resist their occupation. And despite Israel's incessant protests to the contrary, Israel as the occupying power does not have a right to self-defense against the Palestinians. This is analogous to the respective rights of homeowners subject to a home invasion. The homeowners have the right to deter and defend themselves from the invasion. The invaders do not have a legal right to defend themselves from the homeowners. For most people, this makes patent sense. With this said, there are always limits on what those who have a right of self-defense may do to defend themselves. In the case of the Palestinians, they must abide by the laws of war, meaning, in essence, that they may not intentionally target civilians for killing, maiming, or atrocities. At the same time, if one looks at the history of rebellion of the oppressed against their oppressors, for example, the Nat Turner slave rebellion or the attacks carried out by the abolitionist John Brown and his compatriots against slave owners and their families as well, these types of rebellions are always messy affairs, to say the least. You may wonder why Jews so often repeat the phrase, Israel has the right to defend itself. The reason is simple. That right is constantly denied, not just in words, but in action, and sometimes by bullets. It's been rightly pointed out that Israel receives the most sympathy only after Jews are slaughtered. In moments of massacre, the world feels sorry. But when Israel fights back, when it defends itself, it's suddenly labeled the evil oppressor. Let's push the logic of these quotes a step further. If Palestinians have the right to violent resistance due to historic injustices, then by that same logic, Jews should also be entitled to wage war on the Arab nations that expelled, persecuted, and dispossessed them during the Jewish exodus from 1948 to the 1970s, when nearly 1 million Jews fled Muslim lands under duress. Do those nations have a right to self-defense in that scenario? Can any Jew return freely, practice Judaism openly, convert ex-Muslims to Judaism without fear, and criticize Islam publicly, calling Muhammad a madman as Maimonides once did? Would those countries gladly welcome back the Jews they expelled, grant them full citizenship, voting rights, and freedom of speech? We all know the answer is no. This exposes the double standard. Israel is singled out, held to impossible moral standards that no other nation on earth would tolerate, while actual theocracies and authoritarian regimes get a free pass. And the result? Quotes like Maté's don't just distort reality, they justify violence. If Israel is portrayed as worse than Hamas, a recognized terrorist organization, then by extension, violence against Israel becomes justified. If Hamas terrorists can be killed for their crimes, and Israel is worse than them, then Israeli soldiers, and even civilians, can also be legitimately targeted. That is the insidious implication of this rhetoric. The real tragedy here is that it's coming from a Jew, from someone labeled a Holocaust survivor. The irony is chilling. Someone whose people were dehumanized with propaganda is now dehumanizing his own people with even more potent rhetoric. In fact, you could argue that statements like this, because they come from within the Jewish community, are even more damaging than Nazi propaganda ever was. Because they give moral cover, they lend false legitimacy, and they make it easier for the world to look away when Jews are attacked again. Moreover, the repression narrative completely ignores the radical Islamic ideology embraced by the majority of Palestinians. This isn't a fringe view. The hatred and desire to subjugate or kill Jews runs deep. In 1948, just a few years after the Holocaust, multiple Muslim armies attacked Israel and, shockingly, lost. It was during and after this war that many Palestinians fled voluntarily, not because they were forced out. This is not to say there were no expulsions or attacks. There clearly were. But the majority of Palestinians fled due to calls by Arab leaders, fear, and chaos, not systematic Israeli expulsions. The narrative of total dispossession by force is deeply misleading and historically inaccurate. As Islamic history expert Robert Spencer explains in The Palestinian Delusion, the catastrophic history of the Middle East. Peace process. Drive them out from where they drove you out, as mentioned several times previously, is a Quranic imperative, and it is a staple of the Palestinian case against Israel that the Palestinians were driven out of the land. The fact is, however, that the Israelis did not actually drive the Arab Muslims out. This fact is ultimately immaterial to the Palestinian jihad, but it is true. In reality, the Arabs for the most part left Israel because they were ordered to do so by Muslim Arab leaders. Contrary to the contention of the Palestinians and their allies today, the Arab Higher Committee actually exhorted Arabs to leave the new state of Israel, and they obeyed in large numbers. This action had been contemplated for a considerable period. In May 1946, fully 2 years before the State of Israel proclaimed its independence, Abdul Rahman Hassan Azzam, Secretary General of the Arab League, stated that Arab circles proposed to evacuate all Arab women and children from Palestine and send them to neighboring countries, to declare jihad, and to consider Palestine a war zone. In other words, the forced dispossession narrative by colonialist Jews is largely a myth, fueled not by Israeli aggression, but by strategic decisions made by Arab leaders who expected to wipe Israel off the map. The Muslim world was the aggressor, and those who followed that call paid the price. Jews are not to blame for Islamic leaders' refusal to accept coexistence or peace. The real source of Palestinian suffering isn't Israel. It's the Islamic ideology, rooted in Muhammad's teachings and preserved by those who have kept this hostility alive. Israel is constantly cast as the aggressor for doing what every sane nation does, protecting its people. There is relentless pressure on Israel to endanger its own citizens to appease those who openly hate it. It's absurd. No country is morally obligated to sacrifice its own safety for the comfort of its enemies. Nor should Israel let terrorists go unpunished because civilians may die in the process. And yet Israel is blamed more than Hamas itself, a literal terrorist organization. Let's not forget that Gaza has been run by Hamas since 2006, and in 2005 every Jew was removed from Gaza. They had every chance to choose peace. No so-called occupation, they ran the place. Just an opportunity to build something decent. But they didn't. They chose jihad. Enough is enough. Stop slandering Israel. Stop appeasing those who want to dominate or destroy you. And start defending Israel, not out of tribal loyalty, but because it is the moral thing to do. Thank you for listening. Please like, subscribe, comment, and share. And visit my website, Radical Universe.